January 2, 1912. The Pittsburgh Press, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Wintry blasts coop up Wright and woman companion in Love Castle. Chicago architect and his soul pal stick around indoors while newspapermen shout at gates for last words. Special to the press, Spring Green, Wisconsin, January 2. Spring Green indeed. The Chicago architect Wright and Mamah Borthwick, literally and figuratively the woman in the Hegira case, seem sort of disgusted these days with the title someone absent-mindedly gave their chosen hiding place. The love castle of these two romantically inclined persons is about the last thing anyone would dub Spring Green today. Cold weather, the kind that is brewed in Medicine Hat and turned loose in bunches down Wisconsin's broad sweep, surrounds the house which shelters the spiritual Hegirists, and while reporters in vain pound with numbed fists upon the portals, the inhabitants of the place make sneering and certainly uncomplimentary remarks concerning certain stuff printed about us in newspapers with neither morals or brains. Wright, who has just announced that he is doing nothing unconventional in seeking rest from the world and an unsympathetic wife, is expected to be arrested today for beating up a reporter who tried to take his picture Saturday. The reporter was put hors de combat by the Chicago man, who in retaliation went before a JP and swore out an assault warrant against the convention hater. Mamah and Wright are said to be spiritually and financially, especially financially, down and out. Whether or not there will be beans in the pot until the present cool spell gets a-goin's is the couple's greatest worry just now, it is said. August 21, 1914. The Telegraph-Herald, Dubuque, Iowa. Chicago, August 21, special. The murder, by a crazed employee in the Wright Bungalow at Spring Green, Wisconsin, of Mamah Borthwick Cheney and her two young children, has brought to light the interesting romance of Frank Lloyd Wright, world-famous Chicago architect and owner of the bungalow, and the murdered woman who was his soulmate. It was in October 1909 that Edwin H. Cheney, a Chicago lawyer, received a letter from his wife in Boulder, Colorado, where she had been visiting friends, asking him to come for their two children. When he arrived in Boulder, Mrs. Cheney had already left. At about the same time, Frank Lloyd Wright had left for Berlin with the intention of having some books on architectural subjects published. It is believed that the two met in New York and took the same steamer across the Atlantic. At least, they traveled as soulmaters while in Germany. Mrs. Wright had been left to care for her 6 children in the Oak Park bungalow, which her husband had designed. She sent her oldest son, Frank Lloyd Wright Jr., to Germany to induce her husband to return to her. The son's mission failed, and he returned to his work in the office of a New York architectural publishing firm. Later, the son made another trip abroad, with no better results. In September 1910, word was received by Mrs. Wright that her husband was coming back. Shortly afterward, Mr. Wright and Mrs. Cheney arrived in New York. While there, the architect visited the publishing firm by which his son was employed, and Mrs. Cheney accompanied him. The son saw his father, but did not greet him at once. He waited until Mrs. Cheney had walked out into the corridor. The boy then struck Mr. Wright, knocked him down, and blackened both eyes. Mr. Wright returned to Chicago the following month and went back to live with his family. But shortly before Christmas of the same year, the friends of the two families were startled to learn that Mrs. Wright had slipped away on a second hegira. The bungalow at Spring Green, Wisconsin, which was the scene of the murder a few days ago, was nearing completion, and Wright and Mrs. Cheney, who in the meantime had secured a divorce, had established themselves there comfortably. Things went along smoothly enough until it was reported that they had quarreled over the family bill of fare. Mrs. Cheney, or Mrs. Borthwick as she preferred to be called after securing her divorce, insisted on having pork chops, and Mr. Wright held that pork chops were an insult to his aesthetic tastes. Mr. Wright of late has visited his wife in Oak Park. He resided in the same house with her for some time. Mrs. Borthwick remained in the Love Bungalow, and Mr. Wright made frequent visits, dividing his time between Chicago, where his work demanded his presence, and Spring Green. June 9, 1928, Meriden Record, Meriden, Connecticut. Love, Auctioneer. Relics in country home of famous architect go under hammer, following long, drawn-out marital woes. By Don Anderson, staff writer for Central Press and Meriden Morning Record, Madison, Wisconsin, June 8. Taliesin, the wonder cottage on the hillside of the love affairs of Frank Lloyd Wright, has been thrown open to the public by the voice of the auctioneer, and the objects of art which he had gathered in his travels, and many of which were gifts of kings in recognition of his contributions to architecture, have gone on the block. Taliesin has been twice destroyed by fire, and once was the scene of a brutal murder. Each time it was rebuilt into a place of beauty, but at last it has fallen before the wrath of a woman scorned, Miriam Noel Wright, unable to hold the man with whom she had lived for 7 years and finally married, has at last brought his castle of dreams a-tumbling down. The story of Taliesin began nearly 15 years ago. Frank Lloyd Wright left his wife and family and eloped to the Orient with Mamah Borthwick Cheney, the wife of a Chicago neighbor. Returning to this country, Wright built Taliesin on the hillside near Spring Green, Wisconsin. One night, when Wright was away on business, a crazed butler set fire to the cottage and killed Mrs. Cheney and her 2 children as they ran from the place. In grief, the architect went to Paris, where he met Miriam Noel, a sculptress. He brought her to Wisconsin and rebuilt Taliesin. There they lived for 7 years until his first wife secured a divorce and he married Miriam. After the marriage, Miriam left this country and went back to Paris to live, apparently in renunciation of her at last legal home and husband. Enter Olga Milanov, a beautiful Romanian girl. Lonesome and in need of a woman's inspiration for his art, Wright took her to Taliesin to live with him. To this love match, a child was born, and then, when all seemed peaceful, Miriam returned. Wright first sought a divorce. Miriam fought this and won. Then she attempted to gain entrance to Taliesin, where Olga and the child were staying. The architect opposed this move successfully. Terms were reached, and Miriam granted a divorce. Miriam then battled to keep Wright from living with Olga. So far she has lost, but court costs and hurried flights have taken of Wright's funds, and the creditors have been closing in. Although Wright has made many important contributions to American architecture, his best-known work is the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, the only large building not destroyed in the earthquake of several years ago. Many of the art objects sold at Taliesin were gifts of the Emperor of Japan. Wright and Olga Milanov have not been in Wisconsin for several months. They may not marry until the divorce from Miriam has been in effect for 1 year. That will be early next September. August 27, 1928. The Border Cities Star, Windsor, Ontario, Canada. Wright gets divorce and weds dancer. Noted architect and Madame Olga Milanov are married. Will live in desert. Ceremony performed day decree signed in California. Chicago, August 27. Frank Lloyd Wright, internationally known for the turbulence of his domestic affairs as well as for his achievements in architecture, Saturday in California received both a final decree of divorce and a marriage license. He married Madame Olga Milanov, dancer, at Rancho Santa Fe, a suburb of San Diego, on the same day his divorce from Mrs. Marion Noel Wright became final. Formal announcement of the ceremony was made by telegraph to friends in Chicago as follows. Married August 25 at Rancho Santa Fe by the Reverend Charles Knight of La Jolla. Olga Ivanovna, daughter of Ivan Lazovich and Milica Milanov, Cetinje, Montenegro, to Frank Lloyd Wright, son of Anna Lloyd Jones and William Carey Wright, Taliesin, Wisconsin. We are all together well and happy, going to put new life into buildings in the great Arizona desert spaces during the next year or two. This most recent chapter in the marital experiences of the architect marks the culmination of hostilities between himself and his former wife, begun 3 years ago. It was at that time that he first attempted to get his freedom from his second wife for the announced purpose of legitimizing his relations with Madame Milanov, who was about to become the mother of his child. Often repulsed, in this endeavor, He was repeatedly repulsed by Miriam Noel Wright, who persisted in refusals to give him a divorce until 1 year ago, when a settlement was effected. 6 weeks ago, Mrs. Wright entered the bungalow occupied by Wright and Madame Milanoff in La Jolla, smashing $3,000 worth of furniture with an axe. The matter was settled out of court. Baby Eovana, the child born to Madame Milanoff in a Chicago hospital, is now 3 years and 8 months old. She has a stepsister, Svetlana, 12, who is the daughter, by a former marriage, to Vladimir Hinzenberg of Chicago, from whom she was divorced. Taliesin, the home designed and built by Wright at Spring Green, Wisconsin, was sold under the hammer on July 30 for $25,000 to satisfy a mortgage. It was at one time the scene of his romance with Mama Borthwick Cheney, who with her 2 children was killed by an insane butler. Later, Mrs. Miriam Noel Wright occupied it with him, both before and after his long stay in Japan, during which his masterpiece, the Imperial Hotel at Tokyo, was built. It was partially the discovery that Wright had installed Madame Milanoff as housekeeper at Taliesin that enraged Miriam Noel Wright and led to her refusal to give him a divorce.